in a DUI case where you have an officer I had an officer basically trying to testify that my client was speeding. He believed he was speeding. I don't know if in other states an officer doesn't have to do it by the radar. They can say they visually estimated the speed or believed the person was speeding. Somebody nod, let me know if I'm crazy or not. Do they do that in others? Okay, they do that. So here we have it, and I'll just say, so the question, sir, you were sitting in your squad when my client's car passed you. Yes. You did not have time to use your radar to get his speed. Of course not. He was being an ass. But question, so what you are giving us is your estimate of how fast he was going. Yes, based on my training, he was about to say training and experience. In Wisconsin, they love those two words together. I don't know, it's like inoculates them from anything. But yes, based on my training and experience. Question, and when he passed you, all you could do was see his rear. Yep. And you were not fixated on the car, you were doing other things at the time. Yes, so your estimate of his speed is based upon what you saw when the car passed you. Sure, and even at 45 miles per hour, the car passed you pretty fast. In a split second, maybe. And based on that split second, you're giving a very rough estimate. Yes, so that estimate might be off 5 or 10 miles or so. It could be, but I have trained to visually, and then I said, and your rough estimate was that my client was driving 45 miles per hour in a 35. So that's something, that was from 2.5 years ago. My first year, I would have spent 20 minutes arguing with you don't know he was speeding. And you didn't pull out your radar, did you? You didn't have it. So how can you sit here today? But his entire testimony was that he estimated the speed. He never confirmed it. So does that really negate my point that my client was not speeding? So you limit or you neutralize that testimony and say, everything that officer said is fine. He thought that, but that doesn't negate what I'm saying. Now, if he got up there and tried to say it was confirmed, that's a totally different theory you need to have with that witness. But that's why I said in the beginning, you have to actively listen. When you're reading those reports, actively read them. When they're testifying on direct, that's usually when I get my best pointers for my cross-examination that I've already had it written out. I mean, I've slept with Larry's stuff under my pillow for years. I just nerded out on stuff like that. But when they get up there and testify, I'm listening. Is this officer just telling me the evidence that he put in the report, or is he trying to argue the case with the prosecutor? Because it's one thing to assume that every officer, every witness has priorities and objectives. It is not always the officer's primary priority to convict your client. Many officers, when I was a prosecutor and when I was a defense attorney all around Wisconsin, afterwards, their biggest concern when they get on the stand is not to look stupid. They don't want to be tripped up and look like a fool. So you pay attention to that. Because if you're just going to rotely give me the information you gave, that may help me. But I love it when I can get you engaged in something with me. Because I'm about to walk you into this fire and you won't even know you're burning, right? But know that. Don't just assume that officers, because they're officers, are always harming you every time they open their mouths. Sometimes their testimony doesn't even bother what the theory of your case is. The next one I tend to use, it's called hitchhiking. And that's basically where you're bringing forth favorable material as much as it helps you with the witness, and then you jump off the bandwagon soon as they make that right turn, right? And again, this is something we do a lot in cross-examination. We're just not doing it intentionally. So we always have that where how many of us have ever looked at a witness we knew we had to cross-examine and said, their statement doesn't hurt me, or that's not going to hurt me at trial. But do we make it clear to the jury when we're cross-examining that witness, or if we choose to cross-examine that witness? Right? Same thing with hitchhike. And I always say sometimes it's better from the witness's mouth when they're getting that favorable information. Not just that you're arguing it, but that the jury hears it. I think Larry said that earlier. Getting that information that helps you, and then the moment you know they're going to turn, you may go to a different chapter. You may stop dealing with that witness. I may not want you to reverberate everything you just said on direct that hurts my case. So I'm not going to take you through it for 20 minutes unless there's a reason I'm doing it. So this one, it was a question. Your bar has a rule against fighting on the premises. This was the bar owner that ended up firing a client. Has a rule against fighting on the premises? Yes. Following this incident, you fired my client, John, as well as Jacob, the supposed victim. Yes. Aside from this fight, you've seen both of these men fight on 2 other occasions. True? Yes. And both of these earlier fights were started by Jacob, the victim. Well, yes, but please tell the jury who it was that started both of these earlier fist fights. Those times it was Jacob. He says those times it was Jacob. And then he wanted to start turning into why he believed it was my client that started the fight in this particular fight. And that's why I put blah, blah, blah. Because when witnesses do get difficult or they don't want to just answer the question, I tend to sneak in something where, the prosecutor will be able to help you make your points on direct. Or I'm this just to be helpful to the jury, I just need you to answer my question. Right? So I try to find slick ways to let the jury know I'm just trying to elicit this information so you can do your jobs when you go back to the deliberating room. But that's why I say hitchhiking. And make it apparent that that's what you're doing. And know that that's what you're doing. This information is this helps up. Got to get off the train now. Because he's about to take a hard right. And that's not what we want. Right? So when I'm looking at a witness, when I go through it, I'm determining what I'm going to do. Like dealing with a forensic nurse. I've seen the impeachment of a forensic nurse when she's done a SANE exam. And it's like, so you saw the contusions? And she's, yes. From my client, yes. But you don't know that. And then she says she received them after sex with him. But you don't know where they came from. I do as reported by the victim. You weren't there, though. And she, Of course not. But the injuries were consistent with the reported assault. And that, for me, that was an incident when I was simply trying to impeach the witness without thinking, Joshua, how does she really fit into your case? And the next one is limiting the witness. Because this woman don't know what happened. She was just there doing her job and conducted the exam. You saw the contusions, yes. Around the vaginal vault, yes. And you asked Ms. Smith how she got them, yes. And according to your report, she told you they were from John, yes. And she told you this during the exam, yes. And that was because my entire theory of the case was that the devil was in the details. This woman had started a telephone with every person she told, and she did not know how large this mountain was going to get and how deep she was going to find herself. So I wanted to build it every time I could. This is what she told you. You have no extrinsic evidence of this. To the officer, this is what she told you. But you're going off of what she told you. You're not really investigating this. You're seeking to confirm what she said. And it gives you a very different process with her, because now I don't see her as an adversary. I see her as someone that's just following her job. And it makes it easier, because it's always easier when you ain't got to destroy somebody on the stand. For me, impeachment, everyone knows impeachment, so I don't need to go into it. I always do this, though, even though I love impeachment. But that's probably part of my problem, because I look to it a lot. But I would say cross-examination as to credibility forces the cross-examiner to wager his credibility against the credibility of the witness and adverse lawyer. That's why I say use this judiciously. Know that when you seek to impeach, you inject yourself. And so you have to know what that impeachment material is. Have any of us ever seen someone seek to impeach and fall on their face? It makes you shrivel up. So understand that you wager your credibility when you do that. And that's why when you do it, you have to be 100% sure that you know what you're doing. If you need extrinsic material, you have to do it. Or know if the answer is already known, then you don't have to worry about it. Because jurors are not waiting until closing arguments. We all know that. It's like they're watching a tennis match, and they're just ticking who's winning with each answer and question that's given. And the last thing I'll say before we specifically get into confirmation bias, what I said probably about 5 times today. There needs to be a ta-da. If you've questioned a witness and you're about to release them and no one knows why you questioned them, your magic trick has failed. And that's not okay. I've seen that too many times where you're scratching like, why did they even, what were they? And you don't have to ask every witness a question. But there needs to be a point. This is not just rhetoric. A juror should know what was your purpose when you cross-examined that witness. So for me, I remember it as a ta-da. And I literally write it at the bottom of and I move up from that. What is my objective when I finish with this? What do I want the jury to apprehend? And then I move back and question them. Confirmation bias. When a person believes in or searches, interprets, and recalls evidence to support his or her favored theory. I've seen this and cross-examined so many officers on this, and the cross-examination doesn't usually go, do you know what confirmation bias is? That's not how we do it. That's a little bit too on the nose, at least in my experience. But one thing I always like to tell people or remind folks is confirmation bias is not just the rushed or incomplete conclusion the officer gets to. Confirmation bias is delineated in how they search for the evidence, right? How they interpret the evidence, and how they recall it, either in their reports or on the stand. And lots of times that's the most fun I have with officers because they're usually not prepared for that. So what confirmation bias literally is a cognition error that affects information processing, again, and how evidence is perceived and determined, right? So when you're talking about decision making, why was the client arrested? Why was the client charged? Why is the jury here, right? What are those biggest questions you're having to answer? But if you're looking for confirmation bias, it can't just be, he just believes my client is guilty, or he's just assuming. We assume in our everyday lives. And it's similar to what Larry said. This is what we do. It's a survival tactic. Your brain cannot accept all this information. So at some point, it has to make these jumps to procure your safety. This is what people do. So when you get into a courtroom and you think a jury is going to be mad because an officer assumed, they're not. What will raise the jurors' animus is when you show them why that officer assuming was wrong or unfair or inaccurate. So I put ring, confirmation bias. So Officer Jackson arrives on scene. He sees victim crying. Vic says boyfriend hit her. Boyfriend is in the other room. Officer Smith arrives and Officer Jackson updates him. How many ever get an officer arriving on the scene second? Who wrote a report? Is it just me? By a show of hands. Do you ever get a supplemental from a second? Okay. How many of us have ever cross-examined that officer on the information he received from the first officer? Because that's going to go to confirmation bias. I literally have it where I listen to the radios, I listen to the dispatch, and the judges in really up north, they tend to be a little more difficult in my experience, but they used to hate it because I would play what was radio through the dispatch. Boyfriend just beat up female. All right, I'll be there in 3 minutes. He gets there, and then you hear him, he updates his partner, and you hear it on the radio that he told his partner, yeah, boyfriend is in the back. He just beat up this female. She's 26, she's white. It's 2 a.m. So what do you expect that officer to be looking for when he goes back to talk to the boyfriend? Injuries. He's looking at his hand. He's looking for anything to confirm the story that he walked in with. This is the same thing I have in my murder cases where they're looking for the person. And it says at the top of the supplemental report, we briefed the officers at 6 a.m. this morning. Or before we executed the warrant, officers were briefed. When you see those words updated, told, briefed, next officers who weren't there, your antennas need to be rising. Because that's when the officers are feeding them information that removes their ability to look at anything objectively. Because now they're looking for confirmatory evidence. They're not trying to figure out what happens because they're supposed to be conduits of information that follow the evidence, right? That's what you see on Law and Order. That's what jurors are walking in with. That's what I voir dire on when I talk to jurors because I have to meet them where they are. And that's why you have to slowly show them that's not what's happening in this case. They spun the case before they even got the evidence. Other factors that affect bias: emotions, physical state. I believe there were 3 different motion hearings where the judge only agreed with me on 2 of them, but where I was able to get something suppressed because the officer, he actually had pulled my client over 20 minutes before his shift was up. And his shift ended at like 3 a.m. And he just wanted to go home. At least that's the story I told the judge. And this man is tired. He didn't do HGN correctly. He didn't do the walk and turn correctly. He didn't conduct the field sobriety examinations correctly. And it's not because he's a hellion or because he has any animus. This man is tired. I had another one where the officer was working 2 hours past when his shift ended. He was doing overtime, 4 in the morning. I had one that was 3 in the morning. It was supposed theft from a guy's trailer, and it's snow on the ground. It's 20 below, and the officer just listens to the supposed victim that my client is the one that stole everything. I had him there for 40 minutes on, well, you never got out of your car. It was cold. It was late. You're ready to be done. All of these things that we tend to overlook because we do them in our normal day-to-day lives, you have to pick apart. Pick apart. Just like it should be annoying that I keep saying that, pick apart. That's how the officer should feel. Because when he comes in on a theft case, I guarantee you, he's not prepared to be talking about the shifts that he worked.
So the first thing we have to do is organize, right? We can't agonize over this. We've got to organize ourselves. We've got to talk about what I call our scenes and our chapters. And just a personal note, it's terrifying talking about cross-examination with Larry Posner sitting right there. But we're going to talk about cross. So this is my kind of triangle, my cross-examination triangle. So we talked about our theory of the case. We didn't talk about themes. We don't have to. Theories of witnesses. And then I talked about scenes. Buckets where our chapters go. Chapters, which you're going to hear tons about tomorrow from Larry, but we're going to talk about today. And then your questions go underneath your chapters. So these are some scenes. And this is a big, right, when I talk to my lawyers, I do all the training in New Jersey, and when I talk to my lawyers about their ID case, they're like, all right, I have a chapter on the system variables. No chapter. A system variable could be like 16, 20, 25, 30 chapters, right? So you think about the estimator variables or the system variables as a scene, and then you're going to brainstorm what chapters are underneath. So I'll give you an example from the case that we're kind of thinking through. It was dark, right? The alley's dark. That goes to the ability to observe, right? She was tired, physical stress. Her feet hurt, physical stress. Came from behind, right? So you can see there's multiple chapters that are going to wrap up into proving the existence of the estimator variables. And you're going to really take time drilling down into these. So on the top of your page, it may say her feet hurt. And the cross is you have a uniform. You're issued shoes. Those shoes are patent leather. They have a point, heels, 4 inches. You have to wear those shoes your entire shift. Your shift lasts from 7 to 4 a.m., right? That's a narrow chapter. That is all that is on that page where I'm talking about her feet hurt, to get that point that she's thinking about her feet, not what's going on in the alley, right? So, and you would do that with every single chapter. So one thing I don't want you to do is do your chapters or put your scenes in chronological order. I hate chronological order. It's death. And especially in an eyewitness ID case, chronological order is not your friend. And here's why. When we think about primacy and recency, right? Primacy is the first thing we hear we're most likely to believe. The last thing we hear is the thing we are most likely to remember, right? What happens in an ID case? The first thing that happens chronologically is your client is accused of attacking somebody with a machete in an alley. That's not good. The last thing that happens is somebody points to him in a courtroom. The 2 worst things happen at the beginning and the end, right? In this story of ID. So you have to get away from chronological order when you're brainstorming your scenes and when you're brainstorming your chapters, right? So I might say, I'm going to start with the estimator variables, because in my example, I've got some good estimator variables, right? I'm going to start there. That's going to be my first scene. And within there, maybe I just start with the moment she sees the machete, because that's a real dramatic moment. And then maybe I end that scene with her being afraid of what he might do to her in that alley, right? So you see what I'm saying here, I think. So when you're cross-examining the victim, you're going to, of course, talk about the estimator variables. You also want to talk about their motive, that they want somebody to be caught, right? You want to talk about specific words used during the identification. I'm pretty sure is not I'm sure, right? I think it's him is not it's him. Parse out the words and cross on those. Those are part of your chapters. A motive to believe, system variables. The officer called you. On the phone, he said he found someone driving your car, right? How does that impact what you're going to argue about the system variables later? And then inconsistencies. Of course, we want to talk about inconsistencies if it's helpful to our theory. I want to talk specifically about two areas that people kind of have trouble dealing with in cross of ID cases. One is weapons focus. A lot of people will just say the robber had a gun, and that's their chapter. No, 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 no. Weapons focus is all about digging into what that weapon looked like in so much detail that in closing you can say, I counted she noticed 16 things about the weapon and only 3 things about his face, right? So something like he had a machete. This isn't a machete, I realize. I couldn't find a picture of a machete-wielding person that was appropriate. Google can sometimes be dangerous in this conference, which you'll see in a minute in a photo. It was silver. He had a knife. It was silver. It had a blade. The blade was 12 inches. It had some rust on it. He held it in his hand, his right hand. He clenched his right hand, right? Whatever it is, whatever detail, so that you can say, I asked her 15 questions about that machete. Her description was white man, 6 feet tall, blue shirt. Right? 3 things about his face. That's how you know there's weapons focus. And in New Jersey, then I get to talk a little bit about the jury instruction for weapons focus. If I'm in Mississippi, I say she's obviously was looking more closely at the weapon than she was at his face. It doesn't matter whether you're in New Jersey or Mississippi. You don't need the science to be read to the jurors when the science is common sense, but it helps inform the way you craft your questions. Duration is another one. Lawyers will say, it happened fast. Yes, about a minute. A minute's not fast, right, when you get up there and time it. So you can break down the actions and pin a person in, preferably if you can do it at a Manson hearing or Wade hearing if you get a pretrial hearing, but even during a trial. He pushed you down. That took a second. He reached down. That took 2 seconds. He grabbed your purse. It took 5 seconds. She's not going to say it took a minute to push her to the ground, right? And this is where, there are rules, and it depends on how comfortable you are kind of diverting from the rules of cross. But if you have I wouldn't do this first with a witness, but if you have good control over a witness and you're feeling it, you break it down into the seconds it took to happen, and then in closing you say, ladies and gentlemen, she told you that this whole crime took 2 minutes. But when we add up the second it took to push her to the ground, the second he stood over her, the second she grabbed her purse, I'm counting 15 seconds. And that's understandable because she was under a lot of stress and blah, 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 right? So you can kind of get at the time and the duration. And inconsistencies. Really important to bring out inconsistencies. Not going to talk about impeachment, but you want to talk about a couple of things. You want to talk about what about the story changed? How is the story she told at the scene different from the story she told at trial, if that matters to you? You want to talk about when it changed. Is trial the first time she's telling the new story? And you want to talk about why it changed. And the why it changed piece is a piece people skip over, and I think it's critically important in ID cases. Because you might have an obvious reason. Let's say at the scene she said, they stole my purse and it had $40 in it. And now at trial she said they stole my purse and it's a $5,000 Louis Vuitton special bag. Right? Maybe now she's got this motive to lie because it's an expensive purse, right? And you may not want to beat up on an ID witness for that. I'm just kind of giving you an example of like an obvious change in a story, right? Maybe this maybe this changes one of the counts, right? Like one of the lesser counts of theft or something like that. Who knows, right? So, but this is an example where the motive is kind of obvious. But a lot of times there's no obvious motive that a witness changes their mind and people just sort of ignore it. It's because they want to believe, right? ID witnesses, as they go through the course of preparing, they do the ID procedures, they get surer and surer and surer that the person that the prosecutors keeps putting in front of them is the person who did it. So you do have to, at some point, whether it's through some cross-examination questions or whether it's just in your closing argument, you always want to answer that question, why? Why is she pointing to this person? And in a case where you have no obvious motive for the point, I'll usually say that at closing, like, ladies and gentlemen, she was wrong. That was a horrifying event, right? She wants to believe that this is the person who did it. It's not her fault that she pointed the finger at him. It's the police who used the wrong procedures, right? If we're talking about that second scenario. okay? So we want to treat the witness carefully on the witness stand depending on our theory. If it is a rival gang member who our theory is they framed our client, we're not going to be super nice. If it's this witness who genuinely believes your client raped, murdered someone in front of her, robbed her, you have to mirror that emotion. And that's okay because it goes to your theory. So don't be afraid to sympathize, to empathize in your cross-examination with an ID witness when your theory is that this person believes it, but they're mistaken. And take that approach during your cross, right? So we have to think about our demeanor. How do we want to be? How do we want to appear? And that's something you really think about. I tend to be a little bit more aggressive with witnesses on cross. So when I have one of these witnesses, I actually have to make notes for myself about where I'm going to take it down, where I'm going to maybe change my voice, where I'm going to lower my voice, where I'm going to show my sympathy and empathy for the witness. And you need to plan that out just as much as you need to plan your chapters. All right, so cross-examination of the ID officer, my favorite Easter time picture. Like every Easter, it's a perennial favorite. You've all seen it. You're seeing it again. Okay, so this is where people from states, like picking on Mississippi. Mississippi is not the only one. I just happen to know it's one. I'm picking on Mississippi. Well, they say to me, but we don't have any procedures. So what am I supposed to do? How do I cross the cop on procedures? You don't have to be an expert forensic scientist or a cop who is following ID procedures to know bad to tell witness who the suspect might be before the ID happens, right? So however you have to cross, in New Jersey, I can cross on that differently because we have the procedures. In Mississippi, I'm saying things like, you called her on the phone. You told her you caught somebody in the car, right? I'm just going through that stuff, and in closing, I'm arguing that's crazy. You're telling her to expect to pick out a witness when she comes down to the police station, right? So you want to talk about before, during, and after. So you want to talk about what happened. What did the officer say to her before? You want to talk about during. What were they doing? You want to talk about after, post-ID feedback. One thing, I think I have a slide. I'm not sure where it goes, but I'll say it now because I'm thinking of it. One thing we need to remember these days especially is that body-worn camera footage, if a police officer is reviewing their own body-worn camera footage before they're writing a report, that's post-identification feedback, and all the ID science applies. It literally has nothing to do with my topic, but I'm throwing it out there because I think it's important for us as lawyers to start challenging these write-then-review requirements. These review-then-write requirements that a cop can review their body camera footage before they write their report based on the science of eyewitness ID. And if you have that issue in your trial where the officer is making the ID, so you have an officer picking out the client he brought drugs from or whatever, you want to go through a line of cross about you watched your body camera footage first and argue to a judge or a jury that that violates all the principles of eyewitness identification. It's the same science and the same scientists that are doing that research.
The opening story narrative creates a prism. What I mean by that is if we get up and we give the more compelling story in opening, the jury is likely to see evidence through that prism as it comes in. They'll be looking at it and thinking, does this fit with what Belzer told me in the opening? Because I agree with our last speaker, openings are evidence to the jury. I mean, it really is, right? That's just how they see it. So I'm sure you know this, but don't ever get up and say what I'm about to say is not evidence because man, I love my speaking much more than anybody else speaking in the courtroom at that point. There's no question. I'd rather be testifying than anyone else. So that's the prism we're going to create by telling a compelling story. My openings are really, literally, nothing more than a story. I get up, I start with the story. Hopefully I've organized it. It's got an arc. It's got drama. And at the end, I sit down without asking for a not guilty, without explaining what the defense is. If I haven't spent enough time on that opening, that it's obvious what the defense is, and it's obvious my person's not guilty, then I haven't done enough work yet. I haven't figured it out yet. Because stories, when we see movies, they don't have to tell us whether the person is a good person or a bad person or not guilty or guilty. It's obvious. Steven Spielberg, who's a pretty good storyteller, I would say, had this to say, though, and this has to do with openings. Has anybody here, and I'm going to put my hand up, I'll be the first one to admit it, sort of written their opening in the car on the way to court on the morning you're going to give it, like in your head? Fuck yeah, right? I've done it. Hopefully I haven't done it in a long time, but yeah, I've done it. My God. We don't want to do that. We don't want to do that for this reason. People have forgotten how to tell a story. Stories don't have a middle or an end anymore. They usually have a beginning that never stops beginning. Anybody know a person who tells a story like that? It's like, oh, for the love of God, please bring it to an end. Or get me a butter knife because my wrists need some attention. It's just like, man, I'm not going to, I have a relative who's like this, my mother. I'm not going to tell you who it is, though. So we want to spend time on it. Now, what the hell does racing pigeons, advanced techniques, have to do, breeding and pairing, with our work at hand? If there's anybody here who has an answer to this, I will be so impressed. Nothing. It has nothing to do with it, but I was looking for an image having to do with advanced techniques, and I came across this book, and I thought, this is so wild. It's like, I want to get this book and start breeding and pairing pigeons now that I had some free time. Right? It's just like, I just had to use it. But this is about advanced techniques. I told you we're going to try to get to that. I don't want to watch, so I'm just going to check my time. All right, advanced techniques. The courtroom is, this is from a theater person in the 50s, Peter Brooks, an empty space. Courtroom is an empty space. What Peter Brooks was talking about is that theater had become too much about the trappings, the sets, the costumes, not anymore about interaction, conflict, the story, right? But for our purposes, and this is, how many people here are public defenders? Keep your hand up. Keep your hand up if you're a public defender, and you have a huge budget for demonstrative evidence. Keep your hand up. What? What? This is the cheapest demonstrative evidence you're ever going to hear of. We're going to use this empty space, and you can do this whether you can move around the courtroom or not. It's much easier if you can move, but you can do it even if you can't. If I don't tell you how, remind me. I can make this space in the Weller courtroom anything I want. It could be any scene that I want in the context of my case, right? It can be a car on a drunk driving case where the officer's outside the car and you're going to create the car because you're trying to create a relationship or power imbalance, right? Or fear, whatever the case may be. It can be a bedroom in a sexual assault case, in the right sexual assault case, right? It can be the car ride with the mom and the little girl on the way to go see the social worker, right? Which was how I used it in a child sexual assault case. Created that car ride because that car ride was crucial to what was said after that and why it was so inconsistent with anything that had come out before that. It could be a bedroom where somebody allegedly climbed in through a window to have non-consensual sex with somebody, and you're going to create how unreasonable that would be given the makeup of the bedroom. You can create this space, and once you do, as long as you're consistent with it, the jury will see it. They'll see it. How many people have ever seen live improv? You should see more. You should see some live improv because it's amazing what they do with an empty space, right? In live improv, unlike SNL, usually it's just a blank stage, maybe a chair, maybe a hat rack. I mean, there's just not a lot, but they're creating space. And watch, what happens is every single actor that's up there has a contract with each other that if I create a space, we're in a bus. Then everybody else who's in that scene is in a bus. Nobody's going to violate that rule. And we're going to do the same thing. We're going to create a space that's consistent with not guilty or innocence in our case. We're going to be consistent with it. We're going to respect it. We're going to refer to it throughout the trial, and we're going to revisit it during the closing argument. Let me give you a concrete example. The Old Style Inn. Anybody ever been to the Old Style Inn in La Crosse, Wisconsin? It's a great place. You have? No shit. What? Well, La Crosse is way in western Wisconsin. Okay, there could be another one. I mean, Old Style was a big beer in Chicago and Wisconsin for a while. This one's in La Crosse, Wisconsin. And I had a case at the Old Style Inn. Here's a couple of pictures from the case. The one on the top there is the front of the building. I don't know if you can tell, but there's two doors. There's a door that's closest to you, blue, and a little bit further down, there's a little bit blue there. That's the second door, right? This is in the inside. Straight back is where the bar is. Got a patron here, obviously. And then, you know, they have some gambling machines, that sort of thing there, for fun only. For fun only. So my case is, my guy's the bartender. He's got a sawed-off bat behind the bar filled with lead. A guy comes in screaming about the Afghanistan war, acting sort of unruly, a little bit scary. My guy whacks him on the head, busts his head open, causes permanent brain damage. The allegation was reckless endangerment, first-degree reckless endangerment, that there wasn't defense of others, defense of self, that sort of thing. Our defense was defense of others more than self. What I did in the opening is I set up the courtroom, the wall of the courtroom, as if the jury is right where those chairs are, sitting up against the bench. You see what I'm talking about? Right? And my guy's then right behind them. So if you're the jury, I'm going to talk about the fact that Mr. Johnson was standing here, and the patrons at the bar were about where you all are. Now, behind you on that side would be one door, and over on that side is the other door, and we got the gambling machines over here, right? And so then I set this whole thing up, and every time I talk about the guy coming in and what he's saying, I'm doing it right here, and I'm like, can you see him coming in? This is the opening, right? This is all the opening. Can you see him coming in? Kinesthetic people, right? Can you see him coming in? He's yelling. The bartender's scared for himself, but not as much. He's scared for these other people because the people are turning around to look. They're turning around, they're looking. Now, when you're from the front row, you're having this urge to run to look because that's just the nature, right? They're turning around and looking. And we set up this whole thing. Do the cross-examination of the guy who got his head whacked open. Do the same thing. I want you to imagine that we're in the bar right now. You're on the witness stand. I want you to imagine we're in the bar and that the bar is right here and that the doors are there and there. Are you with me? And we do the whole cross where he's now in my space, right? Same thing on the direct with my client. Mr. Johnson, you heard me talk about this earlier. I set up the bar there with the doors in the back. Is that accurate? All right, well, tell us some more. Give us some more description about it. Right, and he sets up the whole thing, and then I'm standing down here as if I'm him for that entire direct, while he's up there telling me what's happening, and I'm watching it happen as he's explaining what I'm seeing. Right? Does that make sense? And you get up in the closing, and you remember when he came in? Do you remember how scared people were? They're all in that same place. That's the story. That's the power of the story. The judge, who I know fairly well, told me after the case that the trial was over in the opening because the story was so real and so compelling, he didn't see how anybody was ever going to erase it. And what's interesting is the prosecutor in that case walks into my bar, right? I now have home court advantage because he's using the bar I set up. If you ever have a prosecutor who does this shit to you, wipe it away. Just get up and say, no, that's not where the bar was. It was set up like this. The bar was over here, right? Don't buy into their story. We create our own.
I said, so something I want you to watch. When we go into the courtroom, if you think it's not about race, here's what's going to happen. On my side of the courtroom, it's going to look like homecoming at Hampton or Howard. On your side of the courtroom, not so much. Do you think it's still not about race? Well, if you try to bring this issue up, we're going to motion with the judge to try to preclude you from being able to talk about it. Okay. And can you tell me sort of what the general gist is? It going to be motion, judge, we hereby move to preclude the defense from being able to talk about reality, to give the client a fair trial, and to live in a fantasy land. Is that sort of the nature of it? Well, no. We think that what you're trying to do is unfairly prejudice the state by discussing a topic that's so explosive, a topic that jurors would never think about, but for you introducing it. Because most jurors don't see color. All right, they don't. So why don't you tell me how they're able to see the blue door to the courtroom they're supposed to enter if they don't see color? She's like, that's different. You know what I mean? Like, for example, looking at you, I just see a lawyer. I don't see a black man. Okay. I said, that's right, because Pensacola has the whitest beaches. Curtis Flowers. You may be familiar with this case. Perhaps one of the most heartbreaking examples of how prosecutors become so fixated on the idea of convicting someone that they will try again and again and again. I'm sure by now most of you have read, if not the opinion, the summary of the opinion. But I encourage you, please take a look at the jury selection. Take a look at it. Some of the questions, normally you might have to read between the lines, but literally the subtext of it, it's absolutely incredible just how they were just frankly blatant about it. It being making sure that they were talking about race in the way in which they talk about it. So if they do it their way, then let me give you some ideas, because I know this isn't really just supposed to focus on the law, but just the storytelling. So one of the things I learned a long time ago from my father is the idea that if you want the ice to be broken, you have to be the one to break it. You guys know about Batson. I'm not going to make you guys go into cold sweats. This is not going to be a law school class, right? But let's jump to, I think, really sort of the meat and potatoes here about this. Being willing to walk the plank first. So what I try to do in jury selection is I will stand up and I'll pick someone, and I'm going to be honest. I usually pick someone white because I need to make it uncomfortable, a little bit of tension there. And I'll start off by saying, ma'am, sir, I want you to do me a favor. You promise me that you're going to be extremely honest. I'm asking you these questions. Oh, yes, absolutely, 100%. I can be fair and impartial. Yeah. What am I? I mean, you're the guy representing the guy who did it. No. That's not what I mean. I'm not a lawyer. I just want you to tell me, what am I? What's my race? That's when everybody gets tight. That's when it gets quiet. They start thinking back to that diversity seminar that happened last year when they were sweating bullets, fearful of giving the wrong answer. And of course, they all know deep down inside, he's black, but he's trying to trick me somehow. What's the appropriate term now? Did it change in 2020? Right? I know it was black when I was in elementary school, and then it was African American and people of color. What is it now? What is it now? And so you see them look to the judge for a little bit of guidance, like, well, you're black, I guess, right? Why do you say that? Well, and Lord knows, dear God, one day, before my time on this earth is over, all I want is the ability to see the thought balloon, to see what they're really thinking. Because I know it, but I just want to see it like that graphic, because it's almost like, on the iPhone when someone's texting you and that little bubble comes up and you're like, what? Don't know what it is, but you can just feel it. So I said, well, why do you think I'm black, and what is black to you? Oh, that's when they're really like, Judge, that thing you said about hardship, yeah. Everyone in my family is dying of starvation right now. If I don't leave, my house will blow up. I have to get off. So I go, well, because you look black. And that's when you see some of the other whites like, damn. She said it. We're thinking it, but she said it. So again, what does it mean to look black? Well, your hair looks black. But man, this hair is pretty much straight, and there's nothing up here. So it makes you think I'm black. Why couldn't I be, for example, Hispanic? Okay, yep, that too. At this point now, she's going to say whatever. Maybe I'm from Uzbekistan. Absolutely, just stop questioning me. Just don't talk to me about it. But the reason that I start off by doing that is that it opens up a discussion, obviously, and you guys know about this, about bias, right? About what we think when it comes to the table, the issue of race. And then what I'll do that really freaks them out, especially in Orlando. Let's go back to our example with the woman. And she goes, well, you're black. I said, where do you think I was raised? I'm assuming here in Florida, since you live here. I said, well, guten Morgen, mein Name ist James und ich komme aus Deutschland. Ich habe in Deutschland für 25 Jahre gewohnt und ich bin nicht ein Amerikaner, ich bin ein Deutscher. Oh shit, then they really lose it. He's something, he's speaking another language that sounds like German, what's up? And so I'll say, well, how about if I told you that I am, like most blacks, a mixture. On my father's side, it's Native American. He was in the military. I was raised in Germany, and I spoke German before I spoke English. What would you think then? Some of the quotes that I've gotten, I think you were making that up. You don't look mixed. And I didn't know that there were black people in Germany. But by this point, she's relaxed a little bit because what's happened, she hasn't been fired from her job. She hasn't been canceled. And we're starting to open up the discussion about race. Then, what I really do to make it even more of an issue, hopefully you live in jurisdictions where judges allow you to do individual voir dire. Like if you're practicing primarily in federal court, you know what it is. Can everybody be fair despite the government's advantage? Yes, thank you. But at least in state courts, we have a lot of judges now who are willing to allow us to do this extensively, individually. But questionnaires, you'd be surprised. How many of you, say in the past couple of years, have done questionnaires where you've brought up the issue of race? Okay, all right. Some interesting responses that you tend to get. So, we talked about this, how do you see me? Here's one, how do you identify yourself? So, ma'am, you said that I'm black, but I've told you that I'm mixed, but the assumption is I'm black. What are you? Well, I guess I'm white. Well, what does that mean? What does it mean to be white? That's when you totally get 100% the silence, but then someone else volunteers usually to come in and say, well, by white, someone of European ancestry. Well, because she's white, does that tell us anything about the language that she speaks? Does it tell us anything about her religion? In other words, the goal is to try to bring those issues up and to talk about them. And then it's okay and appropriate, and like I did in this case in Pensacola, to ask the jurors, and this is where things really get tough. How many of you have ever used the N-word? No, not you. It was an issue. So I asked the question, prosecutors, they stand up as if they're in a CrossFit class about to do burpees. Objection, Your Honor. We go up and approach the judge. Judge, just as I feared. Mr. Smith, the militant from the all-black school that doesn't let white people in. His mother's dog is named after an anti-white bigot. Wants to inject the N-word into this case. Only for one reason, because he wants riots. Not an actual riot, but really something akin to a riot in this courtroom. Because black jurors are so unable to control their emotions that once they hear this, they're going to say, I don't care what the evidence is. OJ, OJ. And we can't have that happen. I'm not too far off from her comment to the judge. And the judge goes, well, Mr. Smith, are you injecting race into this case? No. Oh, you want an explanation? All right. So, Judge, no, I'm not, because part of the discovery involves the use of the N-word. You have a white person who's an alleged victim, and my client's African American. And I think I need to be able to question jurors because if there's a potential racist or someone who can't handle issues of racism in this jury pool, I need to have them go and get out. All right, but I want you to be very cautious. Is there another way that we can discuss the N-word without saying it? Okay, so let me make sure I understand this. When we play the 911 call, we're going to say, she's been kidnapped by the N-word. Or can we just be adults and be honest and admit that people have said it and they've heard it? And I think, frankly, if someone has used that word, that's probably something that I want to know about and my client wants to know about, particularly in a place that's known for its white beaches, Judge. It's like, okay, all right, very well. I'll let you go ahead and do it, but are there any other racial terms that will be used during your jury selection? Just keep watching. So we go back, and at that point, there were a few. There was one lady who was very candid and honest, and she goes, listen, when I was younger, it was used at our dinner table often. And I did say it, and I now realize that I've made a mistake by saying that and doing that, and I'm sorry. And it's something that I try not to do again in my life. Then there's always the most famous response from another guy, well, I use it because I think if your people use it, I should be able to use it too. I listen to Eminem and a lot of rap, and they use it all the time. And then anytime you bring up Eminem and rap, what are you going to have? A vibrant discussion. Because that's when someone says no, that's N-I-G-G-A, nigga. That's right, I see some nods over there, as opposed to the other word. But now at this point, it's the prosecutor's nightmare. We're talking about Eminem, the N-word, hip-hop, who's black, who's white, all of this stuff, right? Now, I'm going to be very honest. I'm not going to say that this is easy. The very first time that I tried to do this, to bring this up, it's nerve-wracking, right? Because the system tends to suppress this. The last thing any of us want is that dreaded call from what? Disciplinary committee. It's my understanding that you use the N-word in court. We need to talk about whether or not this profession is for you, okay? But if we don't do it, and I think what we do is we allow those issues just to sit back there and they're not brought up,